Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Today I want to talk to you about the TV show For All Mankind. This is produced by Ronald D Moore, who is the guy behind Battlestar Galactica and Outlander, and it's on Apple TV Plus, which is why I'm not going to give you a review of it. Suffice to say, I quite enjoy it. I do want to talk about the kind of hooks into history and space history and what I found interesting about it. So the basic premise is the Apollo program is doing its, race to the moon, and the Soviets get there first. How could this happen? Well, I think the critical moment in the Soviet space program where everything went wrong in terms of the lunar race was Sergei Korolev unfortunately dying during what should have been a routine operation. And Sergei Korolev was not just a great engineer, great rocket scientist, he was a very good organizer and very good at dealing with politicians. And the Soviet moon program largely struggled because of teams not working together and not getting the political support that it needed. Because it lacked the political support, they never were able to do enough testing on the ground before they committed to test flights. And as we know, all 4 test flights of the massive N1 rocket failed for things that would have been caught on the ground if they had done sufficient integration testing. After Korolev, incidentally, it was Vasily Mishin who took over, and he had the unenviable task of making this work. He stepped down after the N1 was cancelled, and it would be Valentin Glushko, who of course wasn't a fan of the N1 at all because it didn't use hypergolic engines, and I believe he actually had stages that were being built cut up with torches just to ensure that the thing was completely destroyed. And of course the engines ended up in a warehouse to be found decades later. So the N1 as a rocket was smaller than the Saturn V. It had something like 30 engines on the first stage. Those engines were much more efficient than the F1 engines used on the Saturn V, but there were a lot more of them. They didn't really use gimbaling to steer. The engines instead had fine control throttling so that they could adjust the torque from one side to the other. There were 3 main stages that before they got up into orbit. Unlike the Saturn V, which had 2.5 stages to get to orbit, and that same stage would then carry them to the moon. Once they were in orbit, they had a stage which I think was Block G. Maybe I'm forgetting, and that would push them to the moon. Then Block D would be the one which would actually perform an insertion into the moon. The spacecraft that they had was like a Soyuz, but it was the service module was much longer because it had to contain the fuel to escape lunar orbit. There was the lander sitting below that, and then they had the Block D engine, which was burning kerosene and liquid oxygen and had turbopump driven engines, unlike the US, where everything once they left Earth orbit was all pressure fed hypergolic. So again, that's another thing that the Soviet program was perhaps more advanced in, or perhaps they just needed the performance so they had to go with riskier turbopump based engines. So from there, the Cosmonaut, in the show it's Alexei Leonov, who of course was the first person to perform a spacewalk, and he was seen as the person that would be performing this because he had all the experience, and he was a legend. And it's sad that he died recently, but all heroes eventually meet this end. So they would have to spacewalk across the outside of the spacecraft to get to the lander, the LK vehicle. They would detach that, and then using the Block D, which they used to insert into orbit, it would decelerate them until they were about a few thousand feet above the lunar surface, moving at a few hundred feet per second. That would detach, and then you would have a lander that would have a few seconds to decelerate and land on the surface. This lander has an interesting design. It instead of being like the descent module, the 2-part vehicle that you have for the Apollo program, it has the Block E, which is a little engine cluster at the bottom. They actually have 2 engines on this bottom engine here. They're hypergolic engines. And there's a center engine that's able to fine throttle, and then there's a single engine with 2 nozzles on either side. And the whole point is that if one of the engines fails, the other one can still carry them back into orbit. So the main center one is what's used during descent, and if there's a failure, the outside ones are then used to carry them back into orbit. The landing legs are cool as well because they wanted to be able to land on any surface, and the requirement was down to 30-degree angle. And they were concerned about when the thing landed at speed, it might settle wobble around and then fall over. So there's actually rocket engines, little solid rocket motors, that push the spacecraft into the surface of the moon to make sure that it doesn't wobble. So yeah, that would be how they would get down. Alexei would get out and he would do his speech about, the for all Soviet people around the world, for all workers or whatever. And then it would take off into space, and it would use the same engines that it brought down. So all that would be left behind was the framework of the landing gear. This thing would carry it off into orbit, where it would then rendezvous with the LOK, the Lunar Orbiting Craft. And instead of docking, well, they would dock, but the docking plane was essentially a grid of holes, and they would stick harpoons into these holes, splay them out, and that would hold them together for long enough so that Alexei could climb around out the outside with his lunar samples. And then they could drop that and then use the big Soyuz-style stage and get back to Earth and land safely to great, glorious, adulation. I've been trying to fly this in Kerbal Space Program on Twitch TV. It's quite interesting that you can actually get as far as you can, as realistic as you can. So yeah, you could check that out. Anyway, the other things have happened. So yeah, this great thing changes everything, right? In the TV show, there are a bunch of real characters. There are Deke Slayton, Gene Kranz, there's Werner von Braun, Thomas Paine. But the astronauts that were on Apollo 10 are totally fabricated characters. So there's astronaut Ed Baldwin and Gordo Stevens. And these guys are sort of first and foremost in the story because they were on Apollo 10, and Apollo 10 was close enough to land on the moon. They could have just done it, but they didn't. So yeah, it does get followed up by Apollo 11, and real astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, they're portrayed in the TV show. They perform the landing, which doesn't go quite as cleanly as it does in real life. And that's just one of many things that's slightly different. Apollo 12, when it launches, doesn't get hit by lightning. Werner von Braun is forced out of NASA early on because it becomes a much more militaristic organization, because they're going now, instead of the race to the moon, it's the race for the base. They've got to find some new way that they can beat the Russians. And yeah, another thing that happens is they decide that they want to bring in women astronauts. And this is obviously an interesting bit of history where, women were basically excluded from the US space program for a very long time. This started out in the 1950s, 1960s. After the Mercury 7 were selected, the doctor that did that selection, William Randolph Lovelace, he was curious as to how women would hold up. So he actually got private funding from the husband of Jackie Cochran. Jackie Cochran was a hugely important aviator. She was the one that organized the women during World War II to fly non-combat flights, to deliver aircraft, cargo. She also was the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound in a jet. Although she wanted to borrow an American F-86, but instead they wouldn't let her have it, so the Canadians loaned her an F-86 where she set speed records and got faster than the speed of sound. So she was obviously interested in this new frontier for aviators, and essentially helped William Lovelace get the money that he needed. And instead of doing all the tests like in one big group, they went through lists of pilots and they looked for good candidates. They found about 19 of them, and ultimately 13 of them managed to pass the tests. And some of them were better than most of the astronauts. The famous one is Jerry Cobb. She was in the top 2% of all candidates, making her better than many of the Mercury 7. But they weren't officially part of any program. They did, however, get some news features, and interestingly enough, this news coverage made it all the way to the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union decided, we should have some women astronauts too. Hence Valentina Tereshkova flying, even although the thing that caused her to get pushed on the schedule never actually happened, because in 1962 they held hearings as to whether the Mercury 13 should become part of the program. And some people were for it. John Glenn was very much against it. And Jackie Cochran was against it, which is has led to all sorts of accusations of, jealousy and other things. She did actually continue to campaign for women astronauts through the 1960s and onward. Anyway, in the TV show, yes, you have a couple of these Mercury 13 are still around, but they have to find a whole new generation. And yeah, they don't have they don't have Jerry Cobb, but they do have someone called Molly Cobb, who is presumably very close to this. And they start out with a bunch of astronaut candidates, and most of them wipe out. And by the end of episode 3, there's a few left, and that's where we leave it. So there's a few other things that have changed because of the reprioritization of the Cold War. The US gets out of Vietnam early, and well, that's the second show I'm watching where the Vietnam War ends early, because of course there's The Watchmen, which is a great show right now as well. That, of course, in that history is won by a giant blue godlike superhero creature thing. Teddy Kennedy, who unfortunately had a little problem where he drove his car into a lake just before Apollo 11. That doesn't happen in this timeline because, of course, he's returned to Washington. He's left his partying behind because he needs to know that, the current government isn't screwing up his brother's grand plans for America. Yeah, I don't know. I'm watching it right now. I'll probably watch it a whole lot more. As I said, it's a show that's really about people sitting around and talking about things. There hasn't been a great deal of action in space, although I'm sure, given some of the shots we've seen in trailers, we might see some more action in space in future episodes. And I'm not even going to comment on the accuracy, by the way. The mission control looks really good, but there's all sorts of minor things. The LEM that I've seen looks pretty good, but again, all sorts of little things that are wrong. It's a TV show. It doesn't have the same budgets as a movie. I fully expect this to be a lot of people talking in rooms, except when the budget accommodates something that's required for the plot. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.